Hi, Founder fans, Jason here, and today we are continuing our discussion with delegates to the First Continental Congress by moving on to Delaware's delegates to the First Continental Congress. And there's only three people we will be talking about today: Thomas McKean, Caesar Rodney, and George Reed. Now, these three people are fascinating, but before we talk about them, we have to get something out of the way about Delaware itself. You see, at this point in time, Delaware was often referred to as the lower counties, as in the lower counties of Pennsylvania. And sometimes you will hear people say that Delaware was kind of a part of Pennsylvania, and this really isn't true. Now, their governments did overlap from time to time, but at large they had separate assemblies, and although they had royal and commissioned governors overseeing each other from time to time, they had separate assemblies and were considered separate entities. And I'll even point out that at certain points, New York and New Jersey were overrun by the same royal governor, and we absolutely never consider them the same thing. So it's not fair to Delaware to consider it a part of Pennsylvania, despite how closely it was associated, and many of the people who were governor of one would be governor of the other. I'm looking at you, Thomas McKean. Now, speaking of Thomas McKean, he was extremely important to the rebellion at large. Thomas McKean was arguably the most important leader of radical Delaware. In fact, he, along with fellow delegate Caesar Rodney, had already been delegates to the Stamp Act Congress almost a decade earlier in New York City. In fact, McKean became such a leader there that Timothy Ruggles, the chairman of the convention, at the end didn't want to sign the grievances they were sending over to Europe, and McKean embarrassed him so much on the floor of the Stamp Act Congress that Ruggles challenged McKean to a duel. Now, don't worry, McKean slinked out the next morning nice and quiet before the duel can take place. But this established McKean, and I should note Caesar Rodney, as leaders of the agitation towards Great Britain all the way back in 1765. Now, McKean, he returns. He, at the Stamp Act Congress, had made friends with Philip Livingston, important leader of New York, John Rutledge, an important leader of South Carolina, which we'll get to in a few weeks, and John Dickinson, who he probably already knew because McKean, as I was saying before, though a representative of Delaware and a major landholder in Delaware, was keeping his primary residence in Philadelphia. So he was familiar with most of the Pennsylvania delegates for that reason, and an important leader of Delaware. Now, that being said, his friend Caesar Rodney, next name there, here he is. Caesar Rodney had also gone to the Stamp Act Congress. So this is the only colony that sends two separate people who from both to the Stamp Act Congress and to the First Continental Congress. So there are two people from Delaware who know people from other colonies. And as we've said in this series, it was a challenge for certain people of other colonies, not just from customs and religions, but literally the way they spoke. Their accents could be so entirely different that someone from Georgia might not understand someone from New Hampshire. Though I should note, no Georgians at the First Continental Congress. That comes at the Second Continental Congress, but the point remains the same. So, Caesar Rodney, for his part, he was from Newcastle County. Of the three lower counties that made up Delaware, he was from Newcastle County, which was one of the counties that was not so radical. You see, at the time, Delaware had two major parties within the colony, the court party and the county party. And the court party dealt more friendlier with the royal government than the people of the county party, who felt that more strongly that the government was really overstepping its bounds. Makes it really interesting that Caesar Rodney over here would team up with Thomas McKean to be such a strong advocate for protestation. Now, Rodney, he had spent his career making his way up in politics. He started at a lower level, working as a clerk and doing all sorts of clerical and judicial jobs. And as a young man in his late 20s, became sheriff of Newcastle County. So he was actually the lone cop, if you will, over the entirety of this county for about 20 years leading up to the Revolutionary War, making him a really, really important figure in his own right, especially in one of the more loyalist-heavy parts of the future United States. Now, Rodney and McKean show up. They're pretty excited. Now, their friend George Reed here, well, this is a different story. You see, George Reed, he was a neighbor and friend of Thomas McKean, but he was very much more of the mind that we shouldn't be so harsh with our overlords in Great Britain. They're great people. We're British. It's the best. Now, George Reed, for his part, He had been a wealthy person who had been in the colonial government for quite some time. He did not go to the Stamp Act Congress, but he was a hesitant rebel. He does. All three of the men from the colony sign the Continental Association at the end of the First Continental Congress, which is one of America's founding documents. And then he would go on to vote. When all three return for the Second Continental Congress, Reed would vote against independence. Now, what's interesting is just after the First Continental Congress, about a year later, when they are having a year and a half, when they're having the debate in Delaware to separate from England and to give permission to these three delegates who would still be there 2 years later, Delaware was debating whether or not these gentlemen should get permission to vote for independence. Now, what's interesting is Caesar Rodney at that point had become Speaker of the House, and Thomas McKean was leading the debate on the floor. So Caesar Rodney and Thomas McKean literally convince the handful of representatives of Delaware to support independence. And in fact, like many states, Delaware itself declares independence, I believe it was June 15th, 1776, and then send instructions to these three men who were actually in the room, so didn't need to send the instructions anywhere. And they are given the ability to vote to declare independence with the rest of the colonies. Now, Reed surprises everyone in the days leading up to the vote by saying he is not going to vote for independence. Now, let's not get mad at him. He comes back around, don't you worry. But he is the reason. It's Reed's resistance to voting for independence that splits Delaware, and we need this vote to be unanimous. And that leads to Caesar Rodney's famous ride, where he rides 80 miles overnight in a pouring rain, lightning storm, with cancer and his eye covered because his ailment has a huge cancerous tumor, I suppose, on his face. So he only has one eye, riding through the rain. Famous story. Gets there as the sun comes up, just in time to vote for independence. Thanks a lot, George Reed. However, all three of these men, though they don't all vote for independence, all three of these names are the three names from Delaware that are signed to the Declaration of Independence, because Reed decides, well, if I'm outvoted, I'm going to join the cause, because he did not like what Great Britain was doing. That was for sure. That's why he was a delegate in the first place. I do want to note, all three of these men, one of them very briefly, but they all end up being president of Delaware for a brief time. Before Delaware had a governor, they were president for a while, much like Pennsylvania did. Again, another reason people confuse them as having the same government. McKean, for his part, would be a governor of Pennsylvania as well. Rodney, he's governor for a while. He dies just after the war ends. Sadly, his cancer gets the best of him, so he doesn't live to see the United States Constitution completed. And I told you you'd come around to George Reed because, well, George Reed is one of the men who helped write the United States Constitution, and he signed the Constitution. So Reed is one of the few people to have his name on three major American founding documents: the Articles of Association at the beginning of the war, the Declaration of Independence, and the United States Constitution. If only he wasn't serving as president of Delaware and signing the Articles of Confederation, he'd join Roger Sherman signing all four. But nope, just Roger Sherman for that one. As for McKean, as I said, he goes on to be a senator in the U.S. Senate, and he ends up being not just a president of Pennsylvania and a president of Delaware, but I do believe, and I'm going to double check before I say this out loud, because man, I have a lot memorized here, but Thomas McKean does go on to be Chief Justice of Pennsylvania. Almost said he was Chief Justice of Delaware. No, he goes on to be Chief Justice of Pennsylvania. Again, making him one of the most important. Thomas McKean is one of the most underappreciated American founders. Caesar Rodney has that great story, so he gets a little more appreciation than you might expect, but good for him. And George Reed, a name that's almost entirely forgotten, and when you hear of it, it's in the Caesar Rodney story as the guy voting against independence, though I am going to say again, he goes on to sign the Declaration and write the Constitution, help write the Constitution. So that is a brief summation of Delaware's situation going into the First Continental Congress, and the background and a little bit of the future of the three gentlemen who serve for Delaware at the First Continental Congress. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, do me a favor and hit like in the description there. And if you're new here, definitely subscribe. I talk to you about the American Revolution 7 days a week. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.